Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. In Kyrgyzstan, power changed hands without actually changing hands. The president removed his most powerful partner, and the state of affairs continue as if the risk had been neutralized. This is not the type of cabinet reshuffle that you would expect in Europe, for example. When the security chief becomes your rival, the presidency does what authoritarian presidencies do: everything it takes. Power rarely disappears, it shifts instead. So as we look at the political changes in Bishkek, we ask, how did the island of democracy in Central Asia get to this point? Well, here's a look at our latest report.
On February 10th, Kyrgyzstani President Sadyr Japarov dismissed his longtime ally, Kamchybek Tashiev, from two of the country's most powerful posts, head of the State Committee for National Security and Deputy Prime Minister. The decree removes a man widely seen as the second most influential figure in the state. Tashiev and Japarov came to prominence together in 2020, propelled by protests over disputed parliamentary elections. Since then, they have governed together closely. Supporters credit them with stabilizing a country that had seen repeated upheaval, while critics argue that stability came at the cost of a crackdown on dissent and media freedom. The official explanation for Tashiev's removal was the supposed need to strengthen unity and prevent divisions within state institutions. Several senior security officials linked to Tashiev were also dismissed by the president. Following his removal, Tashiev defended his record but shed little light onto why he may have been removed. The timing also invites questions. Kyrgyzstan, a small country of only 7 million with close ties to Russia, has faced Western scrutiny over allegations of helping Moscow bypass sanctions and serving as a transit hub for goods. Working closely with the president, Tashiev was a staunch defender of Kyrgyzstani government policies towards Russia. His departure, however, may signal internal recalibration rather than a drastic change in policy. In Kyrgyzstan's politics, alliances are as personal as much as institutional. Removing a figure like Tashiev does not just change a job title, it alters the balance within a system built on carefully managed loyalties.
And now, let's zone in on the east planning portion of our show. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has turned Central Asia into a key corridor for a sanctions evasion. Among the countries drawing attention is Kyrgyzstan, where trade patterns have shifted sharply since 2022. Let's take a closer look at the role this small Central Asian state plays in helping the Kremlin avoid heavy sanctions.
In the first year of Moscow's war against Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan's exports to Russia rose by roughly 250%. At the same time, Chinese exports to Kyrgyzstan surged. Western officials and analysts say the parallel increase suggests that goods restricted from direct shipment to Russia are being rerouted through third countries. German exports to Kyrgyzstan, for example, have multiplied since the invasion, far beyond what domestic demand would suggest. For Moscow, the arrangement offers access to critically needed technology used in its military. For Beijing, it provides something longer term: experience in building trade channels that are more resilient to Western sanctions. China remains focused on securing routes to Europe under its Belt and Road framework, first outlined by President Xi Jinping in 2013. For Beijing, Kyrgyzstan continues to be a useful transit corridor, even if it lacks the energy reserves of its neighbors. Kyrgyzstani President Sadyr Japarov has deepened ties with Beijing, elevating the relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership. Chinese investment now accounts for a significant share of Kyrgyzstan's external debt and trade turnover. Critics warn the model increases Bishkek's dependence on both Moscow and Beijing while exposing it to geopolitical risk. Supporters argue that sanctions-related trade and Chinese infrastructure projects have boosted economic growth. The result is a country more tightly integrated into Eurasian supply chains at a time when global trade is fragmenting.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. For more than 4 years, the Kyrgyz state ran on a tandem engine. The president provided the constitutional cover, the security chief supplied the cohesive hammer. That arrangement ends when the hammer threatens to disrupt the power balance. And about 2 weeks ago, the president in Kyrgyzstan decided that he no longer wanted a co-pilot. Sadyr Japarov removed Kamchybek Tashiev from the helm of the GKNB, and if you don't know what that is, imagine you combine the FBI's day-to-day, CIA's intel gathering, and part of the DHS in one agency. Thus, he began dismantling the network that had turned a security service into a parallel state. Now, this is much more than a personnel change. Think of it as a constitutional-level pivot. Since 2020, the tandem model fused political authority with security muscle. Then, the competencies became a little too big. The GKNB's areas included diplomacy, economics, education, and party management. When a security chief starts cutting ribbons and settling border dispute, he is not that far from running the country. The question in Bishkek was not who outranked whom on paper, but who could mobilize the elite faster when it mattered. And the trigger was really banal in its form: a public letter calling for early elections, accrediting Kyrgyzstan's achievements to the general rather than the president. The message to the palace was clear enough. If elections were brought forward, the security chiefs can believe that it could compete for the crown. And when you come for the king, you best not miss. President Japarov clearly read that as a rehearsal for defection, and that's why it's no wonder he moved before the rehearsal became a performance. So the purge that followed was clinical. Deputies, directors, regional chiefs, ministers all got removed, or in some cases, rotated. Replacement figures were selected for loyalty, obviously. And personnel alone, however, do not resolve the structural risk that produce a second center of power. So, Japarov split the apparatus. Border security and state security were carved out of the GKNB and subordinated directly to the presidency. The parliament, which had long been contested terrain between the two camps, followed soon. The president's public narrative framed the purge as coup prevention, which might just be the most polite synonym for removing alternative brokers of power that I've ever heard. The tandem model of governance that has delivered stability after 2020 also incubated a rival that threatened the presidency in 2026. Japarov's purge is an admission that the tandem was always transitional. The question is, what happens to the sidelined rival? Retirement, quiet removal, or something else entirely? Central Asia teaches us an important lesson here. Today's removed general is tomorrow's unresolved question. And now, here to share more light on the issue is Bruce Pannier, board member of the Caspian Policy Center. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So today we are taking a look at the political situation in Kyrgyzstan. Once known as the island of democracy of Central Asia, seems to be experiencing a little bit of a political storm. Can you give us the backdrop and what actually happened there?
Yeah. Okay, well, the first thing I got to say is that there's been 3 revolutions in Kyrgyzstan. One in 2005, one in 2010, one in 2020. They had all ousted the presidents at the time. The last revolution in 2020 brought in a whole new crowd, and the 2 main characters in this are the current president, Sadyr Japarov, and the now former head of the security service, Kamchybek Tashiev. These 2 have known each other for more than 20 years. They've formed political parties together. They both were thrown in prison for trying to overthrow the government 13 years ago. But they are now, or they were a tandem in power until February 10th, when the president decided that he was going to dismiss the head of security, his friend, longtime friend, while his friend was out of the country, by the way, getting medical treatment in Germany. So it's led to a huge shakeup. A series of officials have been replaced in the last 2 weeks since this happened. So it's the biggest shakeup in Kyrgyzstan for a long time, and we're waiting to see how this develops going forward.
Right, and like you mentioned, the pair has been running the country, and even before they got into power, they've known each other. And I can imagine there being various different dynamics, just being interpersonally, as well as how it affects the functioning of the government. The 2 used to rule the country pretty much together in tandem. But do you see this as a sign of the president consolidating power, and where do you think this will lead?
Well, the interesting thing is, like I said, if there was friction or tensions between the 2 of them, it's certainly been kept out of the public eye the last few years. What happened on February 9th, a group of publicly known figures, some were former officials, some were just well-known activists, poets, former Olympic medalist, submitted a letter to Parliament saying that they wanted some clarity on the next presidential election. And briefly to put that in, to explain what that means, is that the current president was elected under the old constitution, which provided for a 6-year term, which means he should leave or come up for re-election in January 2027. After he was elected president, they approved a different constitution. It gave much more power to the president. And under that constitution, he has a 5-year term. So there was a discrepancy there, and this letter was sent to the president and the Speaker of Parliament and said, we need clarification on this, and it looks like we should probably be having an early election sometime in the next few months. Now, when they investigated this, they found out that the people that submitted this letter, some of them said they were acting on behalf of the security chief, Kamchybek Tashiev, and that they were saying there's 2 factions now and you have to pick sides. Which are you going to be with the general, meaning the head of the security force, or are you going to be with the president? Well, when the president found out about this, that's what prompted him to dismiss the security chief. Considering the number of people who have been dismissed since then, you'd have to think that this was more than just a rift between the two men. I mean, a huge number of people in the security service got sacked. Prosecutor's office, Interior Ministry, the mayors of practically every major city in Kyrgyzstan have been changed. The list just goes on and on. So once the president started looking around, apparently he found a lot of people who were supporters of the security chief, who of course the security chief says he has no part in this. And in fact, publicly, the 2 men say that they're still friends. But the fact is that the security chief he came back to the country briefly, met with the president, left the country again. And like I said, the purge, for lack of a better word, I mean, it's appropriate, is still going on.
All right, I can imagine that being very destabilizing for the country with the purge going on, with so many political figures being changed, head of government, as well as even down to small things like city mayor. How's the country running right now?
Well, the one thing the tandem did when they were in power was really lock the country down. You said at the start that Kyrgyzstan used to have the reputation as an island of democracy, and it was. It had a vibrant civil society, independent media, very strong opposition, political forces in the country. That's almost all been stamped out since 2020 when these 2 guys came to power. And of course, the security chief played a huge role in this too. To his credit, he also stamped out most of the organized criminal groups in the country too. But the fact is, there are no more protests in Kyrgyzstan. The political opposition has been neutralized. Some of the independent media is gone. So the situation is much different than it has been previously in Kyrgyzstan. There's simply no one out there strong enough to oppose the president at this particular time, except possibly supporters of the security chief, and that's the danger going forward. But as far as the usual people we knew who would come out and say, we have to have a change, we have to have new elections, we have to have something, because this is turmoil right now. They've all been cowed and are reluctant to come forward and do anything.
All right, so it does seem like having early election is a sensitive topic for the president, but eventually an election has to take place, right? Do you imagine anything being changed until then to even consolidate more power to make sure he stays there?
He's kind of working on that. When the security chief was in power, of course, you never heard any complaints about what the security service was doing in the country. Just yesterday, there was a story saying they've received 500 complaints about the security service recently. So the president is obviously preparing the ground ahead of time to show that maybe his friend, or at least the service that his friend was the head of, wasn't really on the up and up there, and wasn't just serving the public, that there was other things going on. Money was missing, abuse of power, things like that, without directly accusing his friend or former friend of being responsible for it. He's trying to undercut the powers of the security service. The fact is that the head of security, Tashiev, was probably more popular than the president. They did polls, and the president would regularly just edge him out. But I mentioned that the 2 of them were thrown in prison briefly. The president actually was thrown in prison later for a totally different charge in 2017. So he fled the country in 2013 after new charges came against him. And he didn't return until 2017, and then he was thrown in prison until the revolution of 2020 when he finally got out. So the security chief has actually been out and among the public the whole time. The current president in the last 15 years has been either outside the country because he fled, or has been in prison for about half that time. So, of course, the security chief is better known. He's he's a popular figure. I suppose that's the way to say it. He's a tough person. There's no doubt about it. He beat up a deputy in parliament years ago when the two of them got into a fight or an argument. There was just a couple of years ago where one of the leading opposition figures criticized the security services battle in smuggling, and the security chief got up and threatened to break his arm and throw him in prison. Tashiev, right? So he's got that kind of reputation, and to think that he's going to just step aside and let the president dismantle everything that he's helped to build in the last 5 years is kind of ridiculous. And knowing that there's a presidential election coming in January next year, you have to wonder if they aren't forming a pro-Tashiev faction right now that's going to challenge the incumbent.
Right, so I guess it's safe to say that even as messy as things look right now, it could just be the calm before the storm even starts. Do you imagine, where do you imagine things going? Do you think that this major move is going to eventually help the president achieve his goal of consolidating power, or do you think that's going to ruffle enough feathers to actually start a movement pushing back?
Well, he's certainly taking making many moves right now to ensure that he stays in power. Like I said, he's not, at the end of the day, he's not really as popular among the people as the security chief. The fact that that Tashiev, the security chief, former security chief, returned to the country, met with the president, and was gone within 72 hours, and we don't really know where he went. I mean, he just left and didn't say what he said it was temporary, but he left, and he didn't say when he's going to be back. And the moves that the president's made since the former security chief departed the country indicate that the president's pretty nervous about what's coming. He's trying to dismantle the support structure of the former security chief to the greatest extent possible. So he's got to be a little bit worried about this. Like I said, the former security chief has a lot of popularity among the regular people. He's a tough guy. He's a nationalist. He appeals to a huge crowd. What he's doing outside the country, where he is, like I said, we don't know. It's impossible to believe this person is going to disappear from the political scene entirely. So if he does want to mount a challenge, and he has the right to run for president if he wants to, or put his own person up there to run, then that's when things start to get a little crazier. He said for now the president's in good shape. He says he's still friends with this guy, but as we get closer to the election and people start to say that I'm going to be a candidate to run against the incumbent president, it'll be interesting to see whose name comes up as a challenger.
Do you see these changes and these developments having a wider geopolitical effect, or do you think this is going to be mostly domestic? Well, all the neighbors, I think anywhere in the world, no one wants one of their neighbors to be having political instability. I mean, there's always the risk of spillover, right? Kyrgyzstan's neighbors, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and China, would all prefer that things were stable inside Kyrgyzstan. Like I said, we've had 3 revolutions already in Kyrgyzstan. I think all of them have said at one time or another, that's got to be enough. I mean, you really got to come up with a system that's going to be enduring so we don't have protests and people in the street. So no one wants to see that kind of instability again. And that's what I think worries the neighbors most right now, is that if they lose control again, are they going to get drawn into this? Vacuums in power, you never know who's going to fill it. There is an Islamic segment of society, a very pious segment, but there's also among them a few radicals in there too. Would they take advantage of something like that? The fact that things seemed to be falling apart and no one seemed to be really running the show. These are all things that weigh on the minds of the neighbors, as well as the people inside the country. So we're going to have to wait and see. Like I said, I think the more the president works to dismantle the security service, and he's already done a lot of damage, transferred responsibilities, arrested a lot of people that were involved in this. Again, always saying that he's friends with the former chief, but in the meantime, he's doing everything he can to defang, for lack of a better word, the security service so they present no threat to him whatsoever. But I'm sure everyone in Kyrgyzstan at this moment, at least people following politics, are holding their breath and waiting to see what happens when
Kamchybek Tashiev, the former security chief, finally makes a long statement about his view of what just happened.
Right. So like you mentioned, as things continue to unfold, we'll have to keep an eye out, and it's definitely going to have some impact in the region. In the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight, and thanks for being with us on Eastern Express.
And thank you for having me.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. Rising incomes in Russia have not translated into higher consumer spending, according to recent studies. In fact, expenditure on goods increased only by 0.1% last year.
Official data shows that disposable income rose by more than 7% in 2025. However, households appear to be shifting into savings mode rather than increasing purchases. Total household income grew, with a large share directed into savings and financial assets. The central bank estimates that Russians invested the equivalent of 14.5 trillion rubles, roughly $187 billion, into bank deposits and securities last year. Yet retail data points to weaker demand. Sales of new passenger cars fell by more than 15%. Laptop and smartphone sales also declined amid rising prices and cautious spending.
Armenia has begun talks with Turkish Airlines on launching direct flights between Yerevan and Los Angeles. The discussions were confirmed by the head of Armenia's tourism committee.
Officials say the proposed nonstop route would connect the Armenian capital with one of its largest diaspora communities in the United States. The airline has been described as having the long-haul capacity to operate such a flight, though no timeline has been announced. Turkish Airlines is already expanding its presence in Armenia. The carrier is set to launch daily flights between Istanbul and Yerevan in March, with increasing frequency throughout the summer. These aviation-related talks come amid cautious efforts by Armenia and Turkey to normalize relations.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.